I'm going to introduce John Ruffalo first. He's the CEO of Homer's Ventures, and he's going to give us some welcome.
Great. Thank you, William, and thank you, everyone, for attending. Welcome to 111. This is the first event that we've held at 111. We're still technically in a pre-opening period, and throughout the entire floor is the full nature of the facilities here. But we welcome all of you. It actually worked. We were a little nervous on how this is all going to work, but welcome again. We're really proud to present both William and Albert, two great friends, to launch our first event. We are going to have our official launch party on November 26th. Bilal Khan, who's the managing director, will be sure to provide information on that. 111 is a new concept and idea that's been developed by Homer's Ventures and Ontario Centres of Excellence. It really is an experiment to really build truly a technology cluster downtown Toronto. We're very excited about it. There's lots of amazing resources that you will see a slow build out over them over the next little while. And what this is really going to be about is community building, and to really get the technology community of Toronto really in one place. And we've created a lot of things to provide the resources and to really, we call this the gift to the city, and we want the community to be a part of this. So lots of exciting things ahead. And I will turn it over to William to get started.
Thanks, John. So how about this 111? It is so new, it wasn't even on Foursquare. I had to create the venue this afternoon.
Well, thank you, William. I made it easier for me to check in.
Exactly. That was just in preparation for that. So how many of you, by any chance, tried to get here and maybe ended up at the 11 restaurant, which is a steakhouse on New York? Anybody was using Apple Maps, maybe? That's possible. How many used the Halo coupon that we offered, the $10 coupon? Not too many? You know how long that gets you in Toronto? About 3 kilometers. And I found out yesterday that Toronto is the 20th most expensive city for taxis. It's more expensive than New York and Paris.
Wow.
So $10 will get you 3 kilometers. At this time of the day, it will get you 3 blocks around here because of the traffic. So we want to make sure we use a lot of the Union Square Ventures companies. So we've got Halo covered, we've got Foursquare covered, and now it's time to use Twitter. So if you're going to be tweeting, the hash code is Albert111. So if you go and search it now.
That'll be the new name of the building.
Yeah, they're going to dedicate a room, call it Albert111. So if you go there, you'll see Albert's handle and mine, and go from there. So I want to thank the sponsors very specifically because, just in full disclosure, to put an event like this, it costs money. It's about $10,000 to put an event like this. So I had two options: either charge you $30 per ticket, or charge you $10 and go and get some sponsors. And you know what we did. So I want to thank Homer's Ventures specifically. I want to thank Wattpad because they were really the reason why we got the idea going. I took advantage of the fact that Albert was here in town for the Wattpad board meeting. And I want to thank Ryerson Futures, which is here as well. They are affiliated with Ryerson University, and of course 111 for putting this together. So thank you very much for the sponsors. And I want to thank, there's a contingent coming from Waterloo, brought in by Nabil. And there's a contingent from Mars, so thanks for coming. And as far as I'm concerned, I want to say something about Toronto and Waterloo. And we want to think of the two cities as part of the one ecosystem. I don't think of them as two ecosystems. And we have the best of both worlds, really, here, Albert, because Waterloo is a little bit like Silicon Valley, and Toronto is a little bit like New York. So, and in the US, the two top ecosystems right now are in Silicon Valley and New York. So where else can you have both, the best of both worlds, a bit of New York, a bit of Silicon Valley within 1 hour? So this is really what we have in Toronto.
That sounds great, and we've managed to make investments in both places, so
exactly.
It works perfectly.
Great. So Albert's from New York. Let's start and talk about venture capital, startups, tech. Start by telling us, take us back many, many years, as many years as you want to start. How did you get into technology? And throughout the delicious years, and how did you become a VC? Take us back from the beginning till now.
Well, I was born. So I grew up in Germany, and there was a very fortunate thing that happened, which was as a teenager, I got interested in computers. And I lived in a very small village. And there was one other guy who was interested in computers, and he was a 20-some-year-old student at the university. And he thought it was so neat that I was interested in computers that he gave me all of his books and disks. And yes, remember floppy disks? I'm really dating myself right here. So I got very excited about computers. And then I made many mistakes along the way that allowed me to become a VC. So the first mistake I made was that I thought, now that I have this newfound knowledge of software, that I could make some money for myself by writing software for somebody else, which is what I did. In Germany, it's very hard to get your driver's license. So I wrote some software for a driving school in return for the driving lessons. The driving school turned around and sold the software to every other driving school in Germany. I went, I should have done that. I should have started a business. So that's how I got interested in entrepreneurship and businesses. And then I was lucky. I spent a year in the States, and I really fell in love with the US. I came back here for college. I tried Germany one more time, and ultimately wound up here. And I wound up here at MIT getting a PhD in information technology, and this was now in sort of 93, 94. And I was sitting in my little cubicle, and I was working on my dissertation, which I realized about 3 people would read. Maybe 4, my 2 thesis advisors and my parents, who would try to look at it. And I was like, that internet thing is happening. I mean, I'd seen Mosaic, and I'd been to the first websites. I distinctly remember Yahoo as like a couple of lines of basically, directory. And the first time I saw the internet, I was like, oh my God, this is absolutely going to change everything. And I literally thought that all content was going to be online within a year. That's how excited I was. And I wound up starting a company. And being German, I wound up also trying to finish my PhD. It's actually a bad thing to try both at the same time. But to make a long short of it, started that company, raised some venture capital money, got a taste for that side of the business. The business that I had started ultimately wound up failing because we got sued by a much larger company. It's an interesting experience.
Is that W3 Health?
That's W3 Health. And I also realized that I really was not a good entrepreneur. Sorry. But I realized that there was this other side, the investing side. And so from there, I basically spent 10 years figuring out how to become a VC, and figuring it out by angel investing, by working with VCs, and got to know Brad and Fred, and wound up at Delicious. I wound up being the president of Delicious. And then after the sale of that to Yahoo, joined up forces.
Okay.
So that's a very condensed story. I left out a few little parts. But
how long were you running Delicious? And what happened there? You were there part of that when the sale happened?
Yeah. So the Delicious story is a fun story. So who still uses? Does anybody still use Delicious? Anybody else? It's actually improved again over the last few months. So the story was Joshua Schechter, who started Delicious, was working at Morgan Stanley, and he had a job instead of a quant finance job. And he started a couple of little side projects. Delicious was not his first side project. It was maybe his 3rd side project. And it sort of suddenly kept growing. And Brad and Fred were looking at it and sort of saying, this is kind of interesting. They called me. They said, what do you think of this? Should we invest in this? I wound up meeting with Joshua. And I said, yeah, this looks really interesting. Why don't you invest? And they said, well, yeah, but he's never started anything. He's sort of Morgan Stanley. He doesn't really, you've started a bunch of companies. Why don't you come and help us? And so I basically helped Joshua set up a company, with the sort of nuts and bolts, including screwing up the light bulbs in the new office. And Joshua and I hit it off, and I became the president and helped him hire people, and then we tried to go out and raise a Series B, and Yahoo made him an offer that he didn't want to refuse. So at that point, that was only 9 months later. So all of this happened in this space of less than a year. I helped negotiate the M&A transaction. In the process, I made myself sufficiently unpopular with Yahoo that I didn't have to go along, which is good, because otherwise I'd be in Silicon Valley right now. And so I had some time on my hands, and I started hanging out in Union Square Ventures offices.
Right. So let's talk about the Union Square Venture thesis, because it's known for, famously, for pinning down the large networks of engaged users very, very early on. And there's a bunch of them that you invested in. But can you tell us a little bit if there's an update now? Because I'm seeing you veering off a little bit into peer-to-peer. There is some crowdsourcing. There is some payments. So is it a veering off? Is it an evolution? Is it? Give us the update, and where are you thinking next about investments now?
Sure. So our investment thesis has always evolved not in reaction to what's happening externally per se, but to our evolving understanding of what works on the internet. And we very much try to analyze that sort of from first principle. So when we look at the internet, we see a technology that has some very interesting characteristics. It's global, it's instantaneous, it's free at the margin anyhow. You don't think about the extra picture you upload or the extra email you sent. It's connected through the virtue of the social graphs that exist. And because of the phones that we all carry with us, it's ubiquitous, it's always with you. And those 5 characteristics of the internet are different from any other technology that's come before it. Anything else we've had really did not come close, usually not even on a single one of those dimensions, let alone on all 5. And so what we do is we spend a lot of our time thinking about, well, now that we have this, what does this make possible that wasn't previously possible? So we're very much trying to find things where you're not using the internet or mobile to do something 10% cheaper or 20% faster, but we're using it to do something that really could not have been done before. If you think of something like Wikipedia, and then you try to imagine how Wikipedia would have done with a fax machine, and you pretty quickly realize that it simply wouldn't have been possible. So now, one of the things that we've latched onto is the formation of networks. So one of the things that this constellation makes possible is the formation of many, many new networks. And it's kind of right there in the name. It's Internet, the network of networks. Now, they chose that name when they were thinking about it as a network of networks at the technology layer. But it's also turned out to be true that it's a network of networks at the application layer. So we're particularly interested in finding businesses that have a network effect. So if you think of historical businesses, manufacturing businesses, when you grow your volume, your unit cost declines. That's traditional scale effects. On the other hand, network effects mean that as your service grows, the value of your service to each participant increases. So where we found a lot of network effects early on were in these networks of highly engaged consumers. But we've later begun to understand that those network effects exist in other businesses as well. So here's a business where it may not be obvious that there's a network effect, which is search. So it would seem that you just use a search engine by yourself, and there's no network effect. But it turns out that every user who uses a search engine makes the search engine slightly smarter, because the user will have given the search engine a query, the search engine will have returned a result set, and the user is then making a choice which result to pick from those. So there's actually information supplied, and that's why it's very hard. There's sort of network effects in the search business. That's why it's been very hard for anybody to catch the dominant search engine. So we now look for network effects, not just through the obvious network effect of one person following another person on Twitter, but also through more subtle network effects that exist at the data layer. So I would say it's not a deviation from our thesis. It's just a refining of what the thesis really means and what's essential about it. So it's trying to go back to the first principle of why we came up with this thesis and seeing how we can apply that first principle in other areas as well.
But are there clearly defined subsegments? Like, because you got payments, you got 2 or 3 plays in payments. You have some crowdsourcing place as well, and you've got some education now. These are the more recent. So are these like sub-themes under the umbrella of the network?
It's a little bit the other way around, which is we tend to look at the idea of networks first, and then we ask ourselves, where could they exist? And then we find the areas in which they exist or can exist, and that's the areas we invest in. So we tend to be very sort of thesis-driven, and that thesis has taken us into other areas. So we don't think of ourselves as education investors or finance investors, just like we don't think of ourselves as mobile investors. Mobile is an enabling technology on which you can build certain things that would be interesting to us, such as, say, Wattpad, or you could build things that are probably not interesting to us, like a publishing tool. So when we've approached investing, we've never said, okay, we have to do investments in finance. We discovered that there were certain types of business in finance that seem to have strong network effects. So P2P lending has network effects, just like any other marketplace has network effects, which is the lenders want to be where the borrowers are, and the borrowers want to be where the lenders are. And that's a type of network effect. The more lenders there are, that creates value for every borrower. Additional borrowers create value for every lender. So that has led us into those areas, as opposed to us sort of saying, hey, this is an area we should invest in. Incidentally, we think about geography much the same way. So we don't roll out of bed and say, oh, we should invest in Toronto. What happens is that we find a really interesting company in Toronto or in Waterloo, and then we go invest in that. And we are usually of the opinion that, you know, if the company is happy where it is, we should fund the company where it is instead of telling the company that it should be somewhere else.
Sure. How about healthcare? We have not done anything in healthcare. What are you thinking about? I'm sure you're thinking about it, because you hint at it, you and Fred and others, but can you take us a little bit behind the scenes? If you would invest in healthcare, where would you invest in it? What are you thinking about in healthcare?
So we actually have made one investment. We just haven't announced it yet. So one of the challenges is that, and we're running up against that in finance as well, is that a lot of these emerging networks are not a good fit with the existing regulatory regime. And so no industry is more heavily regulated, at least in the US, than healthcare. And what we're finding, even in the finance side, is that regulators are struggling somewhat with which box to put these networks into. And let me maybe illustrate that with something like the whole ride-sharing and car-sharing segment, right? Like, is a company, whether it's a Halo or an Uber or a Sidecar or a Lyft, is that a transportation company? Is it a cab company? Is it an internet company? And so regulators are really struggling with that at the moment. Now, in these areas, these companies have all been able to operate, and they've been sort of able to carve out areas for themselves, and they're sort of fighting with various jurisdictions. But in healthcare, you really can't do that. In healthcare, you can't sort of say, hey, we're going to go do something, we're going to go throw it out if it runs totally against existing regulation. And most of the types of businesses that we would find particularly interesting have this issue. As a result, we've been very cautious because we don't want to go into something that we think sounds really exciting, but is sort of premised on the idea that healthcare is going to be regulated in a completely different way. Because if we've seen anything in the US, that's a really, really hard thing to do.
But is this going to be a US-centric kind of investment, or is this going to be more of a patient-centric that's regardless of the country? So it can help, it helps the wellness of a patient.
Yeah. So definitely the things that are most interesting to us are things that stand outside of the regulated system. It's just been difficult to find things that are doing really well outside the regulated system. But that doesn't mean that we're not actively looking. So let me maybe illustrate that with education, where we've made several investments. So our education investments are either entirely outside of the existing education system, so something like Codecademy or Duolingo or Skillshare operates entirely outside of the existing paid structure. They're not trying to sell to universities. They're not trying to sell to school districts. We have one other company called Edmodo, which is in use in K through 12, but again, they're not selling to school districts. They are all about bottom-up adoption by teachers. In fact, we have somebody, an Edmodo alum here. So it's a very different model, and we are looking for the same thing in healthcare. And you're right to point out that that is very likely to be something that's patient-centric.
So you can go across the borders. it will help the patient as opposed to the system specifically, which is
Yes.
makes the market bigger.
Yes, and in general, one of the things that the internet is great is, as I said, it was my very first point, it's global, and the businesses that have the strongest growth are businesses that can grow globally. You cannot always find that. In finance, for instance, you have to enter market by market because each market is regulated differently.
Okay, great. Let's stay with the USV topic for one more question. You recently launched a new version of the USV.com, and which some said it looks a bit like Hacker News. And funny enough, you said, I did check Delicious this morning just to make sure. I didn't know if they were still in business, but it looked a little bit like a Hacker News kind of feed right now if you go on a hashtag. So the interesting thing I want to ask you about is, Fred said it took you about 15 months of back and forth, or maybe, like, walk us through the internals. Like, how did you, I know it was announced 15 months ago. Everybody thought in 3 months you'll have something, but apparently you went back and forth, or maybe you had some variation. So how did you end up where you are today? And is this like the beginning of something, or tell us more about that?
Well, we have a full-time day job, so building things is sort of something we do a little bit on the side. I would say that the comparison to Hacker News are obvious because it is somewhat similar in functionality and look and feel. But then again, Hacker News is similar to Reddit, and Reddit is similar to Dig. I mean, all of these sites are somewhat similar in their basic idea, which is that people can contribute things and other people can comment on the things that have been contributed. So that is the basic concept. I think where most of these differ from each other are in the particular community that develops around them. The way we arrived at this was really not unlike the way we arrived at the original Union Square Ventures site, which was a blog, which was sort of trying to figure out a way to engage with the outside world that lets us share our ideas and lets other people contribute. Because part of what we believe is that the way we can be successful as investors is not by sitting on our ideas and sort of saying, here's this little idea, I'm going to guard it, but by being very public about our ideas and having other people then say, well, that's an interesting idea. I happen to know an entrepreneur who's working on something related to that. And so that's why we did the original Union Square Ventures as a blog platform. Now, one of the things we've come to realize is that we now have a large network, both of people who work at Union Square Ventures portfolio companies. We have 50 portfolio companies, people that we've done business with, people who are part of the larger community, who are readers of Fred's blog, of my blog. And we also realized that Fred and I and Andy were blogging quite actively at our own blogs and didn't necessarily want to sort of try and figure out, should I write for the Union Square Ventures blog or should I write for my own blog? Add to that we were already sharing a lot of links with each other, and we realized that the most elegant way of doing all of this was just to let ourselves contribute links. And then once we decided on that, we said, well, why shouldn't we just let anybody contribute links? And for all intents and purposes, it's an experiment. And we're a couple of weeks into it, and so far there are really interesting things on there, but it remains to be seen where it all winds up.
Okay, so you're going to take it into a traditional MVP stages maybe and get feedback.
Yes, and it's pretty hacked together.
Yeah, it's been good. I mean, I've been on it since the beta days. So some of us are comment addicts, so we know who we are. Okay, so tell me, before Tumblr, you were sitting on 12 boards. Is that correct?
I wasn't on the Tumblr board. Brad was on the Tumblr board.
So it was 11 then?
Yeah.
11.
Yeah.
That's on the high end. So how'd you do that?
There are actually several of me. One of them is in another board meeting right now. So.
That's right.
Actually, it enforces a certain amount of discipline. The thing that tends to be true is that because we don't do biotech or nanotech or clean tech, all of our companies face a similar set of issues. And so there's a lot of knowledge that we can bring across companies. But also, when you're on many boards, it forces the discipline to try and understand for each company, what is the one thing that's holding this company back? So for any startup at any point in time, there's 100 things. In fact, there's 1 million things the startup could be doing. This is one of the essential dilemmas for entrepreneurs. But it turns out that there's usually only one thing that's holding the company back. It's a little bit like playing a video game. Like there's something you need to do on this level to unlock the next level. And I see one of my central roles as a board member to help identify what that one thing is at any moment in time. And it changes, right? So at one point in time, it could be you really need to get the next round of fundraising done, because if you don't get it done, you're dead in the water. Or when you've done the round of fundraising done, you really need to focus on building the team. And so what I do is I have a list, and for each company, I have that one issue that I'm really focused on. And that makes it, I think, a lot easier, because otherwise, in board meetings, you could very easily sort of devolve into 17 different discussions and not really have anything useful to contribute.
So are you afraid of giving bad advice to entrepreneurs? How do you know that
my advice is the one truth?
When you have discussions and so on?
This is one of the hardest things about being an entrepreneur, right? Is you hear from all these different people, and anybody you tell at a party that you have a startup will give you unsolicited advice. And the advice will cover the entire 360 degrees of everything you could possibly do. That's the toughest part as an entrepreneur, is to figure out who to listen to and who to listen to on what issue. So I think what I always ideally look for are entrepreneurs who will actually seek out advice, who will listen to it, and then who will be smart enough to only take the good advice, which may or may not include mine at times.
Do you see a difference between mentoring and advising? There's a lot of mentoring going on.
So I'm not sure I necessarily think about a difference between mentoring or advising. The one thing I've come to realize over the years is that one other very essential function of the board and board members and investors is to help an entrepreneur understand what his or her weaknesses are. Because almost every startup winds up being a reflection of the strengths and weaknesses of the founding team. And it's very hard to get the founding team to sort of build on their strengths and figure out how to overcome their weaknesses when they don't actually understand what their strengths and weaknesses are. So whether you'd call that mentoring or advising, I don't know, but a fair bit of my time is spent first for myself trying to understand what I think the strengths and weaknesses of a particular team are, and then figuring out a way to try and help them understand what their strengths and weaknesses are. Because once they understand that, they can be much more effective in their leadership of the company. They can hire people who are strong where they are weak, and they can spend their time on the things that they're strong. And that's a very difficult process, because it's really difficult for all of us, myself included, to actually understand what we're good and bad at.
But is there anything, can you give us an example without giving names where you were not able, you tried to give advice, you tried to coach, you said
So at Twitter, no,
yeah.
just kidding. It's obviously very difficult, because entrepreneurs are usually by definition people who have a lot of determination.
Stubborn.
And you want to be backing people who have a strong belief in their own views. So it's never easy, and I would say the one thing I am still learning, I'm learning every board meeting, I'm learning every interaction with an entrepreneur, is that for different entrepreneurs, I need to approach problems differently. For some entrepreneurs, it's great if you just tell them flat out, here's the issue. And for others, you need to find a really much more subtle way of influencing them. Mm-hmm. So this is probably the toughest part
of a VC's job.
Yeah.
Okay. How patient are you with the experimentation around business models so that a company finds that one that the revenue is behind it? And let me just add one more point. Because the challenge is with consumer companies where the product that the users use is not the same product that makes the money, like Twitter. It's the advertising product that makes the money. Same thing with Google. And that is obvious because these companies have matured. But there are some other companies that are still trying to figure out their business model. So how much experimentation there should be, and is that the right way to do it? And after how many users, like at what point does it become experimentation? At what point does it become serious? And I'll add one more thing, is that the issue I'm seeing is sometimes the product that is needed to make money is not the same one that the company started on. So the founder is not always as passionate or is not always as much of an expert in that particular new product. So is that a challenge that, like, how do you, it's like almost having another new product, different than the user product.
This is going to be a long answer.
Yes, that was one of my.
So let me start with an idea that's central to some of our thinking about revenue, which is the idea of a native revenue model. And it's best illustrated by comparing what happened in keyword advertising. So yeah, Google did not invent keyword advertising. A company that came out of Idea Lab in LA called GoTo invented keyword advertising. It was later called Overture and then was acquired by Yahoo. And their idea was simple, people are searching for things and we're going to let people bid on keywords. Seemed like a very good idea, except they let anybody bid on any keyword. And so the ads that showed up were the ads by the highest bidder, which were often completely irrelevant to the thing that the person was looking for. The great innovation that Google had was that they realized that you needed such a thing as a quality score, and that the quality score should determine how much somebody has to bid in order to place the ad, and if the quality score is sufficiently bad, you don't show the ad at all, no matter how much money is being offered. And that turned keyword advertising into a native revenue model. Native in the following two senses. Number one, it can only exist inside search, right? Only when you have search intent or keyword intent can you have keyword bidding. So the most generic advertising model are banner ads because you put them anywhere. But the second thing about a native revenue model is if it works, it actually makes the experience ideally better, but certainly not worse. And so because we're believers that on the internet, almost every business, we believe, can have a native revenue model. Sponsored tweets, the sponsored tweets I see in my timeline these days tend to be from sponsors that I actually care about. So most of the time, not all of the time, but most of the time, I go, oh, that's actually kind of interesting. And I'll go, oh. So that's actually net adding value. And we want to give companies as much time as possible to go find the native revenue model. And that may require many different experiments. The thing about experimenting is you want to start it early and repeat it often because you don't know what the right experiment is. Exposed on some of these companies, it's very, very obvious. And I think there are certain lessons that have been learned now that are repeatable. So the idea that if your content unit is a tweet, your advertising unit should probably be a tweet, that is now something I think that's better understood. So if your content unit is a Tumblr post, your advertising unit should be a Tumblr post, right? So that's something that's better understood. But in some of the businesses that we've invested in more recently, in the education space, for instance, it's not yet clear what the real native revenue model is. And so we're encouraging those companies to experiment frequently. Where things sometimes go wrong is that I think entrepreneurs sometimes underestimate how long it can take not only to figure out the revenue model, but then tweak it and then build the sales infrastructure and the backend infrastructure and everything else. That's the hidden part of the product that you were talking about to make it all actually work. And we certainly saw that play itself out in a number of our portfolio companies where we often got lucky because they raised a lot of money, but the actual time period from having the aha moment, having the experiment that worked, to then having something that works scalably can be quite a long time period. So
you'd be a proponent of aggressive experimentation and having multiple experiments early?
Well, by multiple experiments in sequence, yes. If you run multiple experiments in parallel, it's very hard to tell what's actually working and what's not working.
Okay. So this brings me to the topic of Tumblr. Because we could argue, and you and I had a conversation on your blog 5 months ago when the deal was still very hot, and I asked you, could it be said that they took it as much as they could inside, and they had to kind of sell because they were not able to monetize on their own? And you said to me, maybe with the passage of time, you would answer the question. So now we're 5 months into it. This is old news now. Can you tell us a little, is this did David Karp take it as much as he could? And is it a reality that not all entrepreneurs can take their companies as high as they can, and they either need help from somebody on the outside, or they need to be acquired, or they could be lucky and raise more money and keep going and still searching?
Well,
right?
I think there's a combination of things that comes together. So when you look at a company such as Tumblr and its trajectory, David built something absolutely amazing from day one. In fact, as far back when we invested, it was already like at a minuscule scale, but it was growing very, very rapidly. Now, when you have something like that, you still are faced with the challenge of building an actual company that can deliver all of that. And in Tumblr's case, that required a couple of different things that had to be built. One is a massive infrastructure. So Tumblr's traffic is very image and media rich. And Tumblr's dashboard is actually quite complicated because you're following people. So there was a whole infrastructure side of the business that had to be built. And then there's an ad side of the business that had to be built. Now, I would say that Tumblr is an example of where the building of the ad side started late and was ramping very, very nicely. But it was sort of, it was still a ways to go before you had a profitable company. And in that situation, I think it's a legitimate choice for an entrepreneur if somebody comes along and makes an offer that's a very compelling offer to say, I sort of feel like we're on the right trajectory, but there's also still a lot of risk involved. And I think David and Marissa developed a really strong rapport, and it seemed like a perfect fit from both sides.
So the timing was good. I mean, otherwise, you would have...
The company would have had to raise more money, absolutely.
To raise more money, maybe not at the same valuation, or maybe yes, depends.
I've always been wrong on valuations, which is a lot of our portfolio companies have consistently raised money at higher valuations than I think the rest of the partnership predicted.
Right.
So I don't want to be doing a hypothetical second guess on a fundraise that didn't happen.
Okay. Okay. Second company I want to talk about is Foursquare. They recently have been experimenting with advertising models, and last week or 2 weeks ago, they opened it up now to a lot more businesses. And tell us a little bit about how different it is from the experiments from last year, or is it a continuation? Where are they at right now? And is this the last chance for them? If they don't get it this time, what's going to happen?
So I think the story on Foursquare is they have ads that work extremely well. They have very good user growth internationally, and they have had some struggle with user growth in the US. Now, whoever is on the latest version of Foursquare on Android has something which they called internally Pilgrim, but which externally is essentially the passive usage of Foursquare. And that, the early data on that is super exciting. So essentially what it lets you do is when you have Foursquare, as you walk around the city, occasionally the phone will suggest things to you that you're either at or that are nearby. So for instance, this morning, when I landed in Toronto, it said, hey, you're in Toronto. Here's some interesting things about Toronto. Welcome back. So what we found is that the sort of active usage of the product in the US was not getting the kind of user growth that we were looking for.
Is it because of Instagram a little bit as well?
I think it's a confluence of factors. Definitely the growth of Instagram played a role. But I think more than that, it was this idea that when Foursquare launched initially, people saw it as hey, I'm going to check in and announce my location. And you can do that on a variety of services now. And so the value that Foursquare delivers today is quite different from what it delivered originally. In countries where there isn't a history, where people don't think they know what Foursquare is, growth is really strong. So I think the challenge is now to get US users who've tried it and sort of think they know what it is to try it again. There's always this, when you need to get somebody to try something again, it's actually 5 to 10x harder than to get somebody to try something the first time.
But how does this relate to them making money on the advertising side, this discovery thing that you just mentioned?
Oh, because Foursquare ads do incredibly well when people look at them. But in order for them to look at it, they have to use the app. In order for them to use the app, they have to be reminded that the app exists and delivers value.
It's to drive usage and engagement, which in turn then triggers some advertising units that get hit.
Yeah. And the advertising units work incredibly well because they are highly localized. And they are delivered to you at a moment when you're likely to be receptive because you're actually in or near the location, or you're actually actively looking for something. So Foursquare's Explore feature has gotten to be very, very good, where you can have both generic queries or queries for specific venues. They've invested very heavily in their search infrastructure, and their data is very good. It powers a lot of the other applications. So if you, let's say, use Uber and you find a location, that's actually a Foursquare location. And so because many other services, including Instagram, use Foursquare locations.
They have like 50,000 developers or so?
I don't know what the precise number is. It's a large number, but it includes some networks with very large reach. And so the quality of the data is very good and gets updated very frequently. And so the kind of what's happened is the value that now exists in how easy it is to find something. So a great many times when I have to go find the office of a company, I just look it up on Foursquare. It's a lot easier to find the office of a company on Foursquare than it is anywhere else.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Let's talk about education. Two sides to education. One, it's going to go into your personal side, homeschooling. You've been talking about homeschooling on your blog, so it's not really that personal, right? Because every Tuesday you talk about homeschooling.
Every Wednesday. Tuesdays are Tech Tuesdays.
Tuesday is Tech Tuesday, yeah. So tell us, I'm very intrigued. I mean, it is very, very interesting, like you're almost like giving us a chronology of your homeschooling experience. You're a big believer in homeschooling.
So what happened was that about 4, maybe 5 years ago, when we were all sitting around at Union Square Ventures, sort of thinking about what are areas where we think some of these network effects are going to play themselves out. And one of the things that I haven't talked about yet, that's also central to our investing thesis, is this idea of unbundling. So if you think about a newspaper, right, the reason the newspaper historically gave you sports and politics and business news and culture news and stock quotes and whatever else was, this is very expensive to print. It was very expensive to distribute. Well, on the internet, all that went away, right? So on the internet, I can be with one click, I can go from ESPN to Politico to whatever business website I want to use. And we started thinking about what other areas have that same characteristic. And it became clear that one of the biggest bundlers of information was education, right? If you think of universities, you go for 4 years, it's bundled, so it's bundled in time. And you get all your courses from the same institution. And where did that model evolve? Well, that model evolved with the Sorbonne, which was sort of the first modern university in like the 1700s, when if you wanted to hear a person speak, you had to be in the same room at the same time, preferably close to the speaker. And if you wanted to read a book, you had to be in the library, which had the one copy of the book, and hoping that not 17 other people were trying to read it. So none of that is true anymore. And so so what we did is we organized a one-day get-together, which we called Hacking Education. And we brought together people from all different directions who were sort of thinking about the future of education. You know, we had people like Mitch Resnick from MIT's Media Lab. We had people like Ben Gordon, who came from EA and was partner at Kleiner. And one of the groups we brought in were some people who were helping other people figure out how to homeschool. And one of the reasons I got interested in that was because I was thinking about, well, not only is university such a bundle, but K through 12 is such a bundle as well. And why do we have this bundle? Why? And why is it that we think that every 13-year-old kid needs to learn the same thing in math? And where did that system come from? And so the more I started reading about that, and there's a fascinating book called The Underground History of American Education by a guy named John Taylor Gatto, who was a teacher in New York and got very fed up with how the system was working. And sort of he went back and kind of said, well, how did we get all of this? And what you basically find is that the rise of modern schooling is sort of coincident with the rise of industrial society. And so we've kind of created an industrial process for creating people who fit into an industrial society. And so that's how we have the sort of, every 13-year-old is going to learn the same thing in math, which the more you start to think about it, the more preposterous that idea sort of appears. And so at the beginning of 2012, we moved back after almost a decade in the suburbs back to the city. And we moved mid-year, and I basically convinced my wife that we should experiment with homeschooling. So we did 6 months of homeschooling. It was sort of as an experiment.
How old are your kids?
They're now 13, 13, and 11.
Okay.
So we did 6 months then. Then they went to a school for a year. And towards the end of that school year, they sort of said to us, can we go back to homeschooling? And so now we're back as of this past September.
So you do it with you and your wife? You alternate? And how
no.
does it work?
No. So my wife is an entrepreneur. She's got a startup called Zigio, and she's busy with that. So we hire tutors.
They come in?
And they come to us.
Right.
They come to the house. It's pretty easy to find tutors in New York because New York is full of very talented people who have jobs that give them a lot of flexibility. So one of our tutors is a published writer. So she spends a lot of her time writing, but she is completely in control of her own schedule. Another one of our tutors is somebody who is a professional after-school tutor who has a lot of work starting at 3 p.m., but has nothing between 8 a.m. and 3 p.m. So it's actually very easy to find really talented people in New York. And then, of course, we also have the opportunity to avail ourselves of all the latest technology. So Khan Academy has come an incredibly long way. I first met Sal Khan when he had recorded about 200 videos. What they've done now, where they have thousands of videos, and they have exercises, and they've tied the exercises to the videos, and they've created this knowledge map, it's really amazing. And schools generally don't use it.
So
Just like they don't use Wikipedia.
Is it the future of education, you think? Is it like an experiment that?
Well, what we're doing is not scalable per se. So I'm not suggesting that our model of hiring tutors is scalable. But some of the components of what we're doing, I think, are the future of education. So the kind of inverted classroom model. So a lot of what our tutors do is they tell the kids, go watch this video, this TED Talk, for instance. And then when I come back, we'll discuss the TED Talk, as opposed to the tutor sort of presenting what's in the TED Talk. So this inverted classroom model is something that is scalable. It just will take a long time for institutions that have been used for a very long time to doing things one way, and where everybody from not just the teachers, but all the way up to the principals, to people at district level are come from a particular model. It'll take a long time for them to adopt these quite radically, almost 180-degree flip models.
Okay. Let's talk about another company, Sift Science. I don't know too much about it, but why is it important? And is there something going on in science in terms of sharing, peer-to-peer? What is Sift Science going to change if that is one of the...
So one of the problems is there are a lot of namespace collisions with startups. So I'm not sure whether you're asking me about Sift Science or Science Exchange, because we've got both.
Let's talk about both, the science aspect. That's
Funding Circle and Circle Up.
I know.
I think we're going to just create one really long chain of names. So let me start with Sift Science. We have not historically done much traditional e-commerce investing, right? So we're not investors in any of the sort of e-tailers, for example. And
except Etsy.
Etsy is a marketplace.
It's a marketplace.
So when I say e-tailers, I mean marketplaces where people are, or not even marketplaces, but curated selections where somebody says, where somebody's basically taken the retail model and moved it online, meaning they select the goods, they source the goods, they sell them, but they're often goods that can be bought in other places as well. That's what I mean when I mean traditional e-tail. Okay. But it's obvious that that's where a lot of the volume is moving. Like, I mean, a lot of the things that we buy online now. So we were thinking a lot about, well, what can we invest in that might have the type of network effect that we're looking for that benefits from this trend of commerce moving online. And so that's what motivated our investment in Sift Science, because as commerce is moving online, so is fraud. And fraud online is just so much more pleasant than fraud offline. Fraud offline, I mean, you can get arrested like right there, and you have to actually touch things, and it's not very scalable. Like, you have to hold up one store at a time or remove money from one cash register at a time. Online fraud, on the other hand, you can be in some jurisdiction that's far away, that doesn't enforce anything. If you found a vulnerability in one place, you can write a script that exploits it across the internet. So fraud online is way better than fraud offline. Which also means that fighting fraud online is way more interesting than fighting fraud offline. And so what Sift Science does is basically use the very latest breakthroughs in machine learning to get data from a lot of e-commerce sites and detect fraudulent activity as quickly as possible. And this is clearly a network effects business, because the more data you get from the more players, the sooner you will discover something, a new fraud pattern. And the second you've discovered a fraud pattern with in one of your clients, if that same fraud pattern occurs elsewhere, you can immediately detect it. And so we're very excited about how
that's Sift Science. They
that's
do the
Sift
fraud.
Science, yes.
And there's Science Exchange.
There's Science Exchange, which is something completely different.
Right.
So Science Exchange makes capacity in research labs available, because the problem with research labs is they need very expensive equipment. And then once they have that very expensive equipment, it sits idle most of the time, because it's only used for the experiments that they run. And they don't often run experiments one after the other. So what Science Exchange does, it creates a marketplace where people can take the capacity of their labs and make it available. And that's turned out to be very powerful, because it allows scientists who might not have had the budget to build their own lab to now run experiments easily in other people's labs. And that's very important for advancing science. Their vision is ultimately that'll also power citizen science. So if you have a really good idea for an experiment and you want your experiment run, you can actually buy, since you don't need to buy all the expensive machinery or even figure out how to employ the people who know how to operate this machinery, you can just buy a small time slot on it. All of a sudden, even citizens will be able to run experiments.
Right.
And one of the very nice side effects of that is one of the things that does not happen enough in science. Because it's so expensive, we don't see enough attempts to reproduce results. And that means that a lot of published results turn out actually not to be all that reproducible, which is bad for science. And so one of the things that's happened through Science Exchange is that people are now giving money specifically to have existing experiments reproduced, because by doing it in somebody else's lab, on just renting the lab for that one experiment, you can do it on a much more affordable budget.
Right. It would be good if they collaborated with each other. We had this discussion last week, I think. A lot of the science research is kind of in silos. And are you doing anything in that regard to help collaboration?
Well, so there's some collaboration that happens around Science Exchange and on the Science Exchange platform. But there are also emerging platforms that are trying to foster the collaboration between scientists. So the two leading ones of that are academia.edu and ResearchGate. In addition to that, there are some really interesting things happening, I would say, kind of that historically were maybe considered to be slightly more of a fringe idea. But there is a site, and I'm drawing a blank on the name right now, where mathematicians collaborate for the first time. Unlike the historical way that people conducted math, where they would sort of lock themselves up for a long period of time, come out with a paper, maybe present it at a very select seminar to a very select group of other mathematicians, and then publish it, on this site, mathematicians publish things the second they have a new idea, and other mathematicians can sort of riff off that idea. And they recently took a number theory proof and improved it dramatically over the course of just a few weeks. This is sort of a question where you have to find a lower threshold, and the threshold started out at like 70 million, and they brought it down to like 150 within literally weeks. So I think one of the fundamental beliefs at Union Square Ventures is that we're really just at the beginning of all the transformation that the internet makes possible. And what I just described is a tiny example of collaboration. If we can get more collaboration in lots and lots of branches of science, it'll be awesome for humanity. Now, I think, again, we have a lot of inertia in the existing system, and the existing system is all about guarding knowledge. It's about patents. It's about copyrights. It's about trying to hold information close to you. And we have a bit of a problem of the anti-commons. So I think it'll, again, take a long time for that model to flip into the model that we could have where we all collaborate.
It would be nice. So it would solve maybe more issues out there.
Yeah, and it's sometimes difficult because you asked about healthcare and healthcare investing earlier. So right now, there's a lot of legislation in the US that deals with the privacy of healthcare data. And the legislation is all aimed at trying to say, well, this is a patient's data, and it needs to stay private, it needs to stay protected. Now, in the pre-internet days, that made a certain amount of sense when you had kind of a paper record of the patient. You really didn't want that paper record to just sort of randomly be flying around, because there was really no upside to the patient from the paper record flying around. With the internet, that actually should be turned on its head, right? What we should really be looking for is legislation that lets each and every one of us publish our medical record, and then sort of protect us from the downside, which means the way to protect us from the downside is to say you can't be denied insurance on the basis of your pre-existing conditions, right? Like in that kind of system, all of a sudden our medical knowledge would explode, and our ability to understand where certain diseases come from, or where they're prevalent, or new diseases developing. I mean, we would have a knowledge explosion. So by doubling down on the idea that patient privacy is the problem, and that we need to figure out ways of locking up patients' records and making them only accessible to the patient and the specific doctors authorized, we're denying ourselves this huge opportunity to grow and to understand why we're sick in the first place. Now, what's really interesting is that just like homeschooling is sort of an edge in education where you see people adopting things outside of the system, you are seeing some of that in healthcare. So there's an interesting company, we're not investors, out in Silicon Valley called CrowdMed. And what CrowdMed does is it lets people who have conditions that the existing medical system has not been able to diagnose for them to publish that to a group that can help them track down what the problem is. Now, they're not publishing on the broad internet, but they're publishing it to hundreds and hundreds of people. So there's a very much high likelihood that your medical information will get out there. Now, they're also not associating a name with it, but once you sort of have, well, it's a female, age 35, living in the Midwest, there's like, and maybe you are also tweeting about your medical problems. It's a short step from there to knowing who that person is. But these are people who are desperate because they've spent years without getting a proper diagnosis, and so they're saying, okay, here's my information, go solve it. In fact, some people on the internet have gone as far prior to CrowdMed's arrival of just doing that, just saying, here's my problems, somebody please figure out. And there are documented cases of where a case that had been unsolved by like seeing 30 doctors in a row got solved because the information got out there. Mm. So all of this is a long way of saying, I think we're just at the beginning of what is a very radical change, because with the internet, often things are exactly the opposite of what they were before. And so for us to all individually and then collectively as a society to wrap our heads around that it would actually be desirable for our medical information to be out there is a lot of steps from where we each sit today individually.
Right. Good. There's hope. Let's talk about Canada. I did an analysis last weekend and counted about $500 million or so being invested in Canada in the soft tech, like without biotech and devices. It's not bad. It's a lot more than last year, but just to put things in perspective, in New York only, last month, there was $200 million in that same category. So we're still a small number. But what was surprising to me, I don't know if it was to you, is that about half of the deals had some US VC in them. So I want to ask you, were you surprised, and is that good or bad for Canada?
I'm not sure. In order to be surprised, you have to have a prior opinion. I'm not sure I had a strong prior opinion in either direction. I think what our observation is that there are a lot of interesting companies being built here. And what we believe is that the money follows the interesting companies. So some people say, oh, Union Square Ventures, you helped build the New York ecosystem. And I think it's misreading cause and effect. We've been successful investing in the New York ecosystem because it's there, and then eventually that ecosystem begets itself. So, when you have an exit like Tumblr, there's a whole bunch of people who made money, which they will then invest in other startups at the early stage, long before we invest, usually. So, it feels to me like instead of looking at necessarily the current gap, it's more important to look at the trajectory, right? And the trajectory feels like it's very good and very strong. Healthy.
I mean, it's good because, as you said earlier, you like to back companies that have global ambitions. And USVC is a partner with that company. So it's kind of good. it's not too bad. For the company itself, it's good wealth creation. But maybe for the VCs, it's not as much because it's leaking VC wealth creation into the US. But I'm just curious, what is the right balance? Like, are you seeing, maybe Canada has the most of that balance because we're so close. I'm sure in Europe, US investments are not half of local investments. Or do you have any data on that?
Again, not something I've spent a lot of time on. I would say that we have made a couple of investments in Europe, and there are some US firms like Excel that has a London office. Again, I think what's happening there is that you have the beginnings of strong local ecosystems in London and Berlin, and those will over time attract local investors. There is a German venture fund, Early Bird, that has raised a brand new fund recently. We've co-invested with them on, I believe, 2 investments. So I think there's just this time delay, and we're seeing this time delay in these geographies. So I'm quite confident that these major kind of evolving ecosystems are going to attract the money that they deserve over time.
Are you getting a lot of requests from Canadian companies right now?
We, I guess, don't really track the origin of requests. So
Are you going to invest in a Canadian company in the next 6 months? USV. Is there one in the hopper?
Not that I know.
Not that you know of. Okay. Well, guys.
But I don't even know anything that we're invested in the next 6 months necessarily until we see it. So.
Good answer. Okay, let's talk about the. I have 2 more questions, and then we're going to take some questions from the floor. So start thinking about them, and then you can come around to this microphone, and we'll do that. So the next question is about what's going on with the VC ecosystem, because a lot of changes are happening with crowdsourcing, angel lists, syndicates, crowdfunding, all of that. So what sorts of discussions are you having at USV in terms of, is it going to affect us, affect you, is it not? Foundry has jumped in. You are watching.
Well, the internet will disrupt everything except for VC.
Sure.
So obviously, since we believe the internet is disrupting everything, that includes venture capital. And we've made a number of crowdfunding investments now. Most of our crowdfunding investments are on either the debt side, the P2P debt side, or in the case of Kickstarters, are on the creative side. But we have one equity investment, which is CircleUp. And CircleUp focuses on consumer products companies, so companies that sell their products in, let's say, a grocery store, like a new type of energy drink or a new type of chocolate. There's no doubt that that's also going to impact venture capital. And I'm on a board with Naval where we just took all of Union Square Ventures out to San Francisco, which we do twice a year. And we spent an hour and a half with Naval talking about AngelList and the trajectory.
You're on a board with him on a company?
On the board of HeyZap.
Oh, okay. And?
So I think it's all great news for entrepreneurs, right? Because it's making more money available at the early stage with more transparency. And it's not bad news initially for venture capital firms that generally invest at a slightly later stage. And if anything, it's increasing the supply of possible companies for us to invest in. Now, it would be naive to think that, it's sort of just like universities. There are universities that are going to take a long time to get disrupted. But it would be naive to think that that couldn't eventually come to a point where a crowdfunding type mechanism can fund a company all the way. In fact, if you look at the historic distinction between publicly traded companies and private companies, one of the fundamental thrusts of the internet is to erase that boundary. Because what was it about publicly traded companies? Well, they had to publish a lot of information, and it was historically costly to publish information, so that was accessible to very few companies. Publishing information is now free. So why is it still the case that in the US there are only 5,000 publicly traded companies? Well, it's because we have a regulatory framework that we've inherited from a different time period, a time period when it was very difficult to collect information on companies, it was very difficult to process it, very difficult to publish it. Now, when the smallest of companies could just, they could just hit a button and put their QuickBooks online or show their Google Analytics traffic. It's really unclear why we're going to have this arbitrary distinction between companies that are public and companies that are private. There should be a distinction between companies that share information and companies that don't. That would be the more sensible distinction. Again, because of where we're coming from and because of how all the institutions are built, it's going to take us a long time to get there. But I'm optimistic that eventually we'll get there. And when we get there, the way VC operates will be entirely different from how it operates today.
How different will it be, like, let's say, in 3 years from now?
I am very bad when it comes to making predictions about the near future.
Take a shot.
I was the one who went down and saw a mistake and was like, oh my God, newspapers are going to be dead tomorrow. So I think the one thing I've learned is that, and this is a quote attributed to Bill Gates, although I've never been able to find this attribution, is that as humans, we overestimate the rate of change and we underestimate the degree of change. So if I made some forecast as to how quickly I think it was going to happen, I would likely overestimate how quickly it happens. But I am convinced that once it happens and plays itself out, it'll be far more profound than any of us can imagine right now.
Are you thinking about dipping your feet into the angel list type segments?
So we've already done this with one company where we led the investment. In fact, it was Science Exchange. But then the company, in fact, just went to AngelList and said, hey, Union Square Ventures is investing. We also would like to find some angels who might have some specific knowledge or expertise that we're looking for.
So they use you as a lead to fill the rest from AngelList?
Yeah, that's what they did. And we can certainly see doing more of that.
That could be one way of doing it. When I did the research in the Canadian companies, there were 2 companies, by the way, that did just that by going using their seed investment by crowdsourcing. One of them raised $150 on Kickstarter. Another one raised $300 on Indiegogo. And that was their seed round, basically.
Well, Kickstarter and Indiegogo, those mechanisms are fantastic if you're building a product because you're getting pre-orders and you're getting a true test of whether there's a market for your product because you're actually asking people to give you the money up front. So if you are building a product, that's way better than asking a VC for money because you're not giving up any equity. So I would do that all day long if I was building a very specific kind of product aimed at that. And in fact, I just backed what I think looks fantastic called Cast AR. Has anybody heard of Cast AR? It's Jerry Ellsworth, who used to work at Valve, and it's unlike Google Glass, which displays something into your eye. It's something that has 2 monitors that display in front of you. Go check it out on Kickstarter.
I'll do that. I'm going to ask you a question. For most of us, it's maybe a boring topic, but can you talk about machine learning and make it interesting to us? That's one of your topics.
Yes, machines are becoming smarter than we. So there are certain types of tasks where already today computers have gotten significantly better than humans. And these are tasks that for some time, again, this is the perfect illustration of this sort of idea that we overestimate the rate of change and underestimate the degree. When I first started programming computers, we were already sort of past the first hype of AI, but we still had to see several other AI hype cycles where people sort of said, okay, we're going to have intelligent machines like next year or within the next 10 years. And of course it didn't happen. And just like many other things, when you say them several times, when you cry wolf, so to speak, and it doesn't happen, people go, that'll never happen. I sort of remember a little bit like talking to some newspaper people after the first internet bubble came and went. They were like, oh yeah, those internet companies, it'll never do anything to the newspaper business. So I think we're sort of in the same situation. Machine learning is really just AI with a new name because people really have such negative connotations with AI. But what's turned out is that we now actually have machines that are better than humans at many interesting tasks, such as image recognition tasks, for instance, such as driving a car safely. And the rate of improvement here is really, really dramatic because if you think of something like the DARPA Grand Challenge, which was this challenge to build cars that could drive autonomously, as recently as sort of 2005, the best car got like 50 miles into a desert circuit that had no other cars, no traffic lights, no intersections. And now it's 2013, and we have self-driving cars that have driven hundreds of thousands of miles on public roads accident-free. So the rate of acceleration that we've encountered here is just tremendous. And so I think the challenge to all of us is multiple-fold. Number one, what are the areas that we're going to use this, and how are we going to build this so that it'll be accessible and useful for most people? So how do we build this so that it's something, let's take diagnosis of human disease, right? If we can build something that's better at diagnosing human disease, how do we make that widely available as opposed to building something and then selling it for exorbitant amount of money to the healthcare system and making the healthcare system more expensive rather than cheaper? So that's one big challenge. And then the other big challenge is, what do we do about work? So, I think it's no secret that we've had this very strange economy for 10 plus years now, where the economy keeps growing, but wages are completely stagnant. And the share of labor as part of gross domestic product is declining. And I firmly believe that that's the beginning of the post-industrial age, that age that has been much talked about since the 70s, but actually has arrived, where machines are better than humans at a lot of things. And so the demand for human labor is actually decreasing. And that'll be a huge challenge for how do we organize ourselves, how do we organize society in that world. And again, I think we're just at the beginning, but the trend lines are already visible. And that'll be a huge challenge to the existing system as we know it.
What can we expect? And if anybody has questions, please start to come over here. Can you give us some examples of, like, at the consumer level, like, is Google now a machine learning kind of application, or besides cars that drive themselves, at the personal level, are there any next examples that might come out?
Things that we use day to day?
Yeah, we will be using.
Search, I mean, is an example of machines understanding what it is you're looking for.
Okay, yeah. Okay, I think we need to see more on that topic. Okay, let's start the questions. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Colin from the Startup Institute at Techstars in Boston. I noticed that yesterday a company called Shuttle in the United Kingdom was purchased by eBay. They do real-time 1-hour delivery of whatever you want. So I've never seen anything like that in any city that I've lived in, but it seems like an interesting trend. Do you see real-time delivery from Google and eBay being a big thing, or maybe not? Or
yeah, we had Cosmo and Urban Fetch. Does anybody remember those? Cosmo? Yeah, Cosmo.
Oh, yeah.
20-minute ice cream. I think there's been an acceleration of everything, right? I think one of the things that the internet has done, for better or worse, it has made us all less patient, right? On the internet, you hit a button and stuff happens immediately. So now you want to hit that shopping cart button and you want the stuff to, like, show up right there and then. So without a doubt, there's a market for short-term delivery. And as it turns out, actually, Cosmo actually was profitable in New York. Then they decided to enter like 17 markets at once when all things went to hell in a handbasket. But so there's a demand for that, and some people are going to figure out how to meet that demand.
Cool. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thanks for coming out, Albert, and thanks for taking our questions. There's this famous story about one of the founders of Foursquare who got his original sort of beta up by hacking together something. He'd learned to code to do it, apparently. I'm sort of in the same situation with my own startup, and I'm wondering if there's anything that you counsel for people in that situation who start a company, who try to be the technical person behind it, and at what point do you counsel that they start to get out of that? And is there any generic advice you'd give to somebody who wants to move desperately away from being the only technical person doing this stuff and do other more valuable things?
So the question is when to move away from being the only technical person. And first of all, it's very commendable that you're learning how to do this. I think it's super important. There's another big success story here with just Kevin Systrom and Instagram, who taught himself how to code. So what I always tell people about finding technical co-founders is that you probably already know that person. So I'm not a big believer in the whole sort of founder dating idea where you can sort of meet somebody and then 5 minutes later you go off and start a company together. Because as it turns out, companies have these huge ups and downs, especially at the early stage. So you're much better off going with somebody who's not maybe the best crack-a-check engineer, but somebody you know and you have a really strong working relationship with or have worked with together, and bring that person in as a co-founder. Then you are trying to find the very best engineer, and sort of make them a co-founder. So that's the first thing I would say. In general, I highly recommend having co-founders. It doesn't have to be symmetrical. It gets very lonely very quickly when you're encountering problems, and it's great to have somebody else who's passionate about the same things. But I think it's very exciting that you're doing it, and I think there are plenty of examples that this actually works. So it's to be commended.
Great. Thank you very much.
Good evening. I'm Eric from Mobs, and I'm working in the Ryerson Digital Media Zone. So thank you so much for coming to Toronto and supporting Wattpad, of course, and the rest of the entrepreneurial community here. You started off talking about the power of networks as far as how the internet has progressed to be a network of individuals and the value behind those networks. And we've seen many of the social titans, Facebook, Twitter, Facebook, share the value of that network with other developers, other products, through opening their platforms as an API. We've seen at an early stage where it's very open, and then as they graduate to a later stage company, and in the case of Facebook and Twitter, but not Foursquare yet, close many aspects of that access to other companies. And I was hoping you could comment on the value of having an open platform at the beginning as an early stage company, how that value changes for the company that's opening their platform, and the long-term effects of the decisions that these companies are making.
So the reason people open up their platforms early on, and first of all, in order to have a platform, it's not just a technical thing, it's also an audience thing. I mean, the ones that succeed have either an audience or a data asset that's unique. The reason they open it up is quite obvious, is because other people build things that they haven't gotten around to building. And the danger, if you're one of those people building that, is that by the time they do get around to it, they're going to say, that's a really nice thing, we're going to do that ourselves. And that's always been true. I mean, that's not new for social networks. I mean, that was true for Microsoft. You know, Microsoft built the OS, people started building applications. They were like, that's a really nice application, we're going to put that right in the OS. And sometimes they would buy the company, sometimes they would not buy the company. So I think that there's nothing new about social network platforms that's specific to this sort of strategy. So what that means is if you're building on top of a platform, it's great if you can figure out how to use the platform to give you lots of inertial energy, but then you have to figure out how to own your own audience. And we have firsthand bad experience with that. Zynga went all the way up on Facebook, and then I mean, there are other things about Zynga that moved to mobile, but Zynga was completely reliant on Facebook and didn't really build its own audience, and paid the price for that when Facebook decided to dial down the juice on Zynga. So I think that's kind of a natural thing. Now,
can you talk? I think we're all familiar from developers' perspective.
Yeah.
Could you talk about the perspective of the Twitter of Facebook?
Well, I think the perspective of the platform is the one I just described, which is that if you see something being wildly successful on you and you are a publicly traded company or want to be a publicly traded company, you are going to emulate that and you're going to do that and you're going to capture some of that value. I think that's almost inevitable. Now, how far that goes, I think depends a lot on what the overall competitive pressure is, right? So I don't think, none of us at Union Square Ventures think that this is forever necessarily going to be the status that there's one gigantic social network. It's not clear yet how it'll get disrupted and what new networks will emerge, and maybe there'll be networks that don't have a central owner. But as long as there are central for-profit owners of these networks, the incentive is if there's somebody creating a huge amount of economic value on your network, you're going to figure out how to get some part of that pie.
Thank you.
Okay, let's do 2 minutes per question. We have 3 more, and it'll be great.
Hi, my name's William from One Data Point. We're a mental health analytics company. Well, just a startup. We're running right into what you were talking about. So reconciling privacy, the entrenched system in terms of pharma, insurance, and medical providers with ideally improving patient outcomes. I know you don't want to talk about timeframes and how change will happen and how quickly it happens, but what would you recommend in terms of how to reconcile that? Work within the system, or?
I think you sort of have to make a fundamental choice, which is either work within the existing system, for which I'm sure there are many ways of building a company, or decide that there is a group that is outside of the system that's not encumbered by the system that you can serve today. It'll be very difficult to do both at the same time, but you sort of have to make that decision. And one of the things that is really important to point out is very few companies should be raising venture capital, right? Venture capital is a way to screw up a lot of good companies, at least half the time. So many good companies are bootstrapped. Many good companies find their early customers within, and they wind up often selling to the existing system. And so there's nothing wrong with that. So I don't want everybody to take away as a message that the only way to build a company is to build it outside the system. That's where the companies that we tend to be interested in it, but whether we're interested or not has no bearing on whether something is a good company or a good startup that an entrepreneur should pursue. So I think you just need to make that fundamental decision, and the two roads will have very different characteristics. Like, if you sell to existing players in the system, it'll be much easier to bootstrap, it'll be much easier to have early revenues. If you go sort of outside on the fringe, most likely initially you won't have any revenues. So only you can know which of these two roads seems more appealing in your particular instance.
All right, thank you.
Hi, my name is Rafi Chaudhry. I work at Feeling Better Now, which is a physician-developed mental health assessment tool. I don't know the previous person. It's just a coincidence.
Wow, that's pretty awesome.
So we've had a couple of meetings with venture capitalists already, trying to get funding to expand our product into more of a live touch thing. I'm aware of what they are looking for. Because you're you have a lot of experience here, I was wondering, what are the structural, from a macro level, what are the structural changes you're seeing in the VC industry now compared to the whole dot-com boom of the late 90s?
I think those of us who were around during the dot-com boom and are around now have a much better understanding that even if you are directionally correct, if you get the timing wrong, it's not good. So this goes back to my sort of if you expect that all of commerce will wind up on Amazon in 3 years and it actually takes, 20 or 30 years, you are going to likely be very wrong with your investing. So I think people are much more realistic about how hard certain things are and how long they will take, especially in areas where the kind of incumbent system makes it very difficult. There's not that open room for innovation necessarily. So I think that's the primary difference. And I would say that because people have now been investing in internet-related things for quite some time, I also think investors have become much more sophisticated about understanding what type of early usage data to look for, how to interpret that early usage data, to understand, is this sort of kind of empty growth or is this sustainable growth? So I think people just are a lot more sophisticated in how they look at what your early data is telling.
Okay, thank you.
Good, last question.
Hi, my name is Nikolai. I'm founder of OpenCare, third person in healthcare space.
I love it. I think it's great.
That's good.
So you've touched on one interesting point about one example of network effects where people publish their data and other patients or doctors help them diagnose what's going on. What are some other big network effect trends you foresee in healthcare in the future?
Wow, if I knew the answer to that question, I would be investing right now. So I think that is the billion-dollar question in healthcare. So obviously, the places to look are connecting physicians with each other, connecting patients with each other, connecting physicians with patients, and connecting medical research with data. So it's anywhere where you can make a connection that should exist but doesn't really exist for the reasons of how the system has grown to date. But if I had a really precise idea, I mean, we've made one investment, and since we haven't announced it yet, I don't want to be breaking it on stage here because I think I'd get a call from the entrepreneur saying, "What are you doing?" So, but pulling a lot of data together from many different sources that was previously disparate, so that you can then find new things of that data, seems like a very promising thing, and there are lots of different ways of doing that.
Thanks a lot.
I'm going to ask you one last question that I think is also something that you're interested in. Surveillance, because that's going on right now. And I think you believe that it's being done the wrong way. So what is the right way, if there is a right way?
So Scott McNeely once said, your privacy is dead, get over it. He was much criticized and ridiculed for it, and I think he got it fundamentally right.
That was many years ago.
It was many years ago. Yes, it was many
20,
years ago.
25, maybe 20.
So the first thing I believe is that your privacy is in fact dead because we're making tiny cameras. Everybody's going to have cameras. There's a startup in New York that's letting people turn their old Android phones into cameras that they can put out of their window to film the streets, which they're using to measure where people are walking. You are going to be taped. You're going to have an electronic footprint. It's just a fact. Now, I think the big question is, what do we do about it, and how does government operate? So I had a call yesterday with people at the Sunlight Foundation, which is doing a lot of work to try and make government in DC more transparent, and there's a lot to be done there. I think the fundamental problem that we have is not that surveillance exists, but that government is trying to be secret about it, and that government is trying to use secret evidence in secret trials, and that is completely undemocratic and goes completely against everything that I think we've stood for. So I believe we need to figure out how to avail ourselves of these technologies, just like I gave the example, the healthcare example. I don't think we can fight these technologies. I don't think we can put the genie back in the bottle. But we need to apply the same set of technologies to government. So, for instance, it should be visible which Congress members are emailing which members on K Street. That should be part of the public record. So I think we need to double down and go in that direction. Again, it's very far from where our thinking is today, but I think that's the way forward. The way forward is not for us to try and have better encryption and to sort of figure out how we can stash our data away and prevent government from snooping. We have to have a government where we know what snooping they're doing and where we can trust that the snooping they're doing is actually in our interest as opposed to used to suppress dissent. And
Are there any governments in the world that are doing it better than others from that perspective?
Nope.
So we're all
I think we've got a long way to go.
Everybody's guilty of that. Okay, on that note, this ends the event. You're welcome to stay until 8 o'clock. We have food on both sides. Drinks are on this side. And thanks to everybody for coming. I really enjoyed it. Big hand to Albert.
Thanks. It's great.